Guys, I won't take up much time. In fairness, it's a good bit to get through here with Stephen and Archie this morning. So again, just to echo what Tom said, I'd just like to thank Archie and Stephen for putting this together. Archie heads up the research and development team within I3PT, and Stephen is a chartered engineer and a science certifier with I3PT with over 20 years experience. So it's great to have two speakers with us this morning with such a vast array of experience. And we've worked with I3PT over the last number of years on quite a few projects, and the kind of work that the guys have done on this topic since Brexit was coming down the tracks and is now upon us, and the work the guys have done on that and CE marking, we've seen it firsthand, the benefits that has on projects with us. So hopefully people will get something out of this morning's session, and as Tom said, if we can keep questions to the end, but we do want the questions, and we'll stay back for 10 or 15 minutes at the end to answer questions that anybody might have. So over to Archie now to kick it off.
Thanks, Gavin. Thanks, Thomas. I'm kind of wishing I was an engineer now. It's a great, it's a great organisation you have there. So our research into CE marking, and particularly what would happen when the UK no longer was a member of the European Union, I suppose, started about in 2019. And it started off really as just, a day's research to figure this out and put it down in a document. But it's the kind of topic that takes a lot of, that has a lot of layers to it. So it ended up being about 6 months' work just to figure out what impact CE marking and declarations of performance have on construction, and for ourselves on BCAR certification. So myself and Stephen are going to try and present over 40 minutes an overview of this topic, and the PDFs of the slides then are going to be circulated afterwards. So if you have any questions or case studies that you want to talk about, you can contact us with that. So we'll start with the Construction Products Regulation, which is the European directive from 2011, which is of relevance to construction products and how they're certified. We'll then talk about how that has been written into the Part D of the building regulations. And we'll also have a look at what products does it apply to. So it doesn't apply to all products, but there's a list of approximately 450 products in an EU database that are covered by harmonized standards. And what if the product has no standard? We'll look at that as well. Sorry, typo there. We'll also talk about just the duties and responsibilities. So who's responsible for fitness of purpose? And then we'll just get into some case studies and some known risks specific to certification risk, and also to things like the structural components. So the Construction Products Regulation, also known as Regulation 305 of 2011, it's the primary regulation act to be adhered to when placing a product on the market. So manufacturers have responsibility for understanding the CPR and for adhering to the requirements of the CPR where particular standards apply to their industry. So products which meet the requirements of the CPR are able to display the CE mark and be sold anywhere in the EU. And the CPR applies a system of harmonized technical specifications and an agreed system of verification and constancy of performance. So for construction products, if you were manufacturing a particular component, let's say you were a steel fabricator, you would identify what the harmonized standard is. So it's EN 1090, and then you would look at what essential characteristics do you need to test for and do you need to display. So within that standard, the very back of that standard, there's an Annex ZA of that harmonized standard. That will tell you which characteristics need to be measured. In some cases for glass, it's only one component, but for other products, there's maybe 8 or 9 different characteristics, deflection, conductivity, things like that that need to be displayed on that declaration of performance. And the manufacturer then undertakes specific testing, and then they complete a declaration of performance. So they write up a declaration of performance, and their notified body then, which is the third party, is able to allow them permission to affix a CE mark to that declaration of performance. So you can have a declaration of performance without CE marking, but you can only apply the CE marking if the DOP meets the harmonized standards essential characteristics. And if there's no harmonized standard, then CE marking doesn't apply, except in the case where it's voluntary. So we'll get into that a bit more. So CE marking, it's not a quality mark per se, but it is an indicator that a product has gone through certain procedures, and it does relate to a standard that's harmonized across the previously 28, now 27 countries of the EU. So it's a declaration by the manufacturer that the product meets the requirements of the applicable European regulation. In this case, the Construction Products Regulation, but it could equally be the Lifts Directive or the Machinery Directive or the Electromagnetic Directive. Now, it's designed as a route to market and to break down technical barriers to trade. It's not designed as a compliance mechanism to say that a product is fit to be used on a construction site in a particular application. So declarations of performance are compulsory where harmonized European standards exist. So where the standard exists, there's a certain period of time in some standards under which you can you have to transition from the old standard to the new standard. And we saw that with steel fabrication, that they actually needed to have material going through their fabrication units in order to put in place a factory acceptance testing system and a quality assurance system. So sometimes there is leeway before the regulation or between the standard being harmonized and between it being applied. So a declaration of performance serves to allow manufacturers provide information on the intended use of the product and the essential characteristics for that declared use. So the essential characteristics are those measures of performance. You know, what as I mentioned, the compression, the thermal conductivity, you know, the bending moment, the glass transmittal, you know, U values, things like that, conductivity. So the manufacturer and the distributor assumes responsibility for the conformity of the construction product. So the responsibility primarily with CE marking is with the manufacturer and their agents, their distributors. So the designer or specifier makes choices of products on the basis of information contained in the DOP. So they're using the DOP to source those essential characteristics on which they can use their professional judgment. So in the case on the right, it's a declaration performance for glass, and it tells us the company name and it tells us the standard. So this glass conforms with EN 12779. Part 5, and it's the Annex ZA of that sets the criteria for insulating glass units. So if you're a manufacturer of a product, what are the steps that you have to take? So the first route is that you will look at the EU database and you will determine, is there a standard that applies to your industry? If there is an applicable standard, and I can demonstrate where you source that, the NANDO database, that standard will have a list in the Annex ZA of the essential characteristics. Then you'll determine from that whether you need a third-party notified body. So in Ireland, you know, the notified body of choice really is NSAI, and this is their information. In France, it might be Kiwa, you know, but in the UK, the notified bodies would have been BRE, BBA, Exova. And the challenge with CE marking is they're no longer recognized for the purpose of EU regulations. So determining if a notified body is required means checking if you need a third party like NSAI to visit your factory or review your tests or look at your technical specification. So that will tell you then what tests you need to do. So, do you need to do fire testing to work out the reaction to fire? Do you need to do compression testing? Do you need to do heat box testing for conductivity? It'll work out all that. And a lot of those tests, if you're a manufacturer, you probably have them anyway for a product. Now, many manufacturers might carry 30 to 60, maybe 100 even product lines. In reality, the declaration of performance should cover each individual product. So you draw up a draft declaration of performance, send that back to the notified body, and they affix the CE mark. But what if you also see products that have CE marking, but they don't have an applicable or harmonized standard? So that's the second route. So the second route is the European technical approval route. And that's a voluntary route where you would decide that you wanted your product to carry a CE marking on the DOP. So not all products can do that. It has to be within the ETA process. So there are certain classes of building systems that would fall within that. So particularly, you'd see it for modular offsite material, external installations, novel products. So it's very similar to Agramont, but it doesn't specifically say as well that product is fit for use in construction for its particular application. But anyone can produce a DOP, but you can't affix a CE mark unless you go through the notified body route or go through the ETAG route. So I suppose with that information, we have to see, well, what does CE marking do and what is it not doing? So CE marking is primarily a marketing tool. It's a facilitating open access to products and across the European market. So it enables free movement of goods throughout the EU member states and beyond. So if you want to choose a block and it's coming from Estonia, you want to know that if you look at the characteristics of that it's undertaken the same testing, that is measured in the same way as a block that's come from, Kilsaran down the road. It places responsibility with the manufacturer or the importer, whoever's the economic operator, places the product on the market. And it's really about self-certification. A lot of the information is coming from the manufacturer, but being verified by the notified body to one of three levels of veracity. And that's what we get into. They're the ACVP systems. It allows the manufacturer to declare performance and place the product on the market. But what does it not do? So it's not evidence of compliance in and of itself. It's not a quality mark. It does not on its own provide compliance with national building regs. And it does not necessarily indicate that a product satisfied any pass-fail criteria. So it's a big part of us saying that a material is fit for purpose, but it's not the full story. Okay, it's you can base your professional judgment on it. Okay, so just going into that. So the purpose of the construction products regulation that covers, I think it's 447 at last count, construction product standards. It's mandatory to have a declaration of performance and CE marking for products that fall under those 447 standards. It's the duty of the manufacturer, importer, and distributor. The declarations of performance use ACVP assessments of performance and verification of factory control. So I'll try that again, APVC. And that has to be attested by a third-party body called a notified body. And since the 1st of January 2021, the products covered by those 447 harmonized standards, they cannot be legally placed on the EU market by notified bodies where it uses a notified body with a UK address because they are no longer recognized. So when we use CE mark products in a construction context, we're relating this back to the Building Control Act and the building regulations, which state that it's the duty of owners, specifiers and builders to ensure product performance is suitable for the end use. So that's fairly generic. When specifying, procuring and certifying works, there's a duty on all parties to check that the relevant product documentation is appropriate to demonstrate and ensure compliance with the building regulations. To do that, the specifiers will ensure that where they're using CE mark products, checks are made that the declaration of performance are valid. So being valid means that it has the correct standard listed, it has the correct product class listed, and that that the notified body is actually valid. And that's the issue since Brexit. The UK notified bodies, from the exit day on the 1st of January 2021, they're no longer recognised, okay? So what do you do then? And so we've been talking to contractors and project teams to say, have a process in place so you know the products that are high risk in this regard, and try and ensure that those certs are migrated across to EU27 notified bodies, before the product is on site, and if not, before certification. So the declaration of performance is probably the key document in all of this. And as we said, it lists kind of the performance for each of the criteria, so each of the assessment tasks. So those tests and calculations that are needed to tell you how the product can perform. It's drawn up by the manufacturer, and the manufacturer, therefore, is responsible for conformity of the product with those declared performances. So alongside the construction products regulation, there's machinery safety directive, low voltage directive, lifts, pressure equipment, EMC. Now, when it comes to equipment, the level of third-party engagement by the notified bodies is generally quite low unless it's related to fire safety. So in a lot of cases, the machinery directive, they really don't have any tasks for a third-party notified body. And so they're called System 4 APVC, and they're therefore, a notified body doesn't apply. So for the purpose of this, we're really looking at the construction products regulations. Now, just to look at kind of the hierarchy of our duty of care, I suppose, as designers, and we look at the overarching regulations being the building regulations, and then working down into the individual regulations and their technical guidance document. So the building regulations refer to proper materials. And how do you know if materials are proper? Well, you need to know that they're fit for their intended use and the conditions of use. So, that means, is that particular material suitable for housing in Donegal, for instance? And that goes through the tested or the measured performance. So there's a number of ways that you can, I suppose, benchmark against that performance. And I suppose the primary standard is through harmonized standards. Now, they don't generally set a floor or threshold to performance. And that usually comes from national standards or from the building regs. So apart from the harmonized standards, there's other ways of establishing fitness for purpose, calculations, etc. And as you move away from that, you start to use more of your professional judgment and rely more on your experience in PI. So performance and use, if you've been using the product for a long time, you can have some faith that it's fit for purpose, or if it's been used in traditional building and has an established history, you can trust that. But essentially, the further you get away from building regulations, from tested systems, from national standards, the further you're getting away from prima facie compliance, and you're getting into the realm of deemed to satisfy and therefore professional judgment. It gets very, it almost starts to get very qualitative and risky. So the upper end of this hierarchy is the place to be, but you can't be there in all cases. So because of our role in BCAR, we spend a lot of time down in the kind of the grayer area towards the bottom of this for particular scenarios. But what are the building regs? What's their purpose? What are they supposed to do? So even if you don't meet a specific clause of the building regs, you have to look at the intended purpose, which is to protect building safety in and around the buildings. Compliance is via the technical guidance documents, and within the technical guidance documents and other standards, they would list what proper materials means in the context of compliance. So fit for the use intended and the conditions of use. And the way that you can demonstrate that, there's 3 routes, but the first one, and they call that the primary route, is that they bear a CE mark in accordance with the provision of the Construction Products Regulation. So for those, 447, it's probably changed in the last couple of months, but we'll stick with that number of 447, that where it's those product classes or materials that it bears a CE marking in accordance with the CPR. So the other route then is, I suppose, where the standard doesn't apply, that you use ETAG, or beyond that, you use Agreement, and the Agreement is quite, it's not clearly defined how that relates to compliance, because Agreement essentially is a route to market for novel products. That means those products haven't really been tested in use, and there is some risk implied. So an Agreement isn't a cover-all. It simply says that if you use this in a particular way, if you use this combination of products or systems as per the manufacturer's guidance and taking into consideration good design practice, then it's capable of meeting building regulations. And you could do a separate seminar on that, but Sean Balfe of the NSAI has said that Agreement has never been used in a legal case because it's not a statutory document. It doesn't hold any weight. You can't rely on it on its own. It's information that's provided to support taking a building to market. So I'll just move on. So the testing house in the UK, a lot of them have migrated across to the EU. And in terms of responsibility, the code of practice for BCAR states that the builder has responsibility for the materials for which they select. Now, if designers select material, that might be another matter. But the responsibility of designers, it's to check the minimum requirements, and they're responsible for ensuring the product has the correct characteristics for their intended use in the construction works. There's clauses from the CIF that you can put in your tenders. Some projects, some contractors have very rigorous procedures for technical submittal and for checking the DOPs. And essentially what we're doing is we're checking the number, that the 0050 in this document, which is the notified body number, and checking that against the database. On the CE mark, you can see the notified body number, and there are certain checks which have to be done on that. On the declaration of performance, what we're also checking is the System 2 performance. So we're checking what is the level of verification and performance. So that's how much oversight has the notified body got on that. So there are 4 AVCP levels, and the first one, 1+, would be for fire safety products that like smoke exhausts, fire dampers, would be 1+, where they would do factory production control, which is they visit the factory to look at the systems and do audits, and they'd also then test the system. So they take testing from the systems. As you move down this scale towards 3, you only have an assessment of the performance at ACVP 3. For 4, all the tasks are by the manufacturer. So if we see, yes, a harmonized standard applies, but it's System 4, we can pretty much ignore it. There's some good documents on available, and you can source that afterwards. But just before my colleague joins, I just want to I just want to jump into, yeah, so building control have also submitted some, or also have some documents on this. If you, there's a link to the Nando database where you have all of the relevant standards. So all of these standards are kept live. You can search that using Control F function and just look for a particular product. So if I look for smoke dampers, I can see that it's EN 12101. If I click on that standard, it will bring up the relevant information for the technical standard that applies. And I can also hit more info here and it will tell me what system that is. So fire detection, fire safety, it's system 1, which means it's a high level of external verification. So I'll just pass over to my colleague Stephen just to look at some specific industry examples.
Gavin and Thomas and to the Engineers Ireland Project Management Division for this opportunity to give this presentation this morning. So I'm going to talk about the post-Brexit CE marking of fabricated steel and precast concrete. So I'm going to talk about the steel fabrication and precast concrete products this morning, and we'll talk about the, I suppose, the status of Irish steel fabricators with regards to their CE marking and the various notified bodies that are involved. So we'll talk about steel fabrication first. EN 1090 is a European standard that comes in 5 parts, and it deals with the execution of steel structures and aluminium structures. And part 1 is the actual harmonized standard. That's the standard that you actually declare performance against. And that's kind of the general rules and procedures around putting in place a factory production control system. Parts 2 to 5 are the technical requirements for steel structures, aluminium structures, and elements that may be also manufactured in steel or aluminium. And we're primarily concerned with part 2, which is the technical requirements for steel structures. So Archie just touched on it there. He mentioned that the various different systems that are in place, you know, when a product requires CE marking. Steel fabrication is done in steel fabrication factory production control is in accordance with a 2+ system for assessment and verification of constancy of performance. The only difference being that the testing of samples by the manufacturer, but in this case, the steel fabricator, is usually not required, and that's because of the one-off nature of steel fabrication. But the 2+ system, as it applies to structural steel fabricators, has responsibilities, obviously, for the notified body and the steel fabricator. Obviously, it's the responsibility of the steel fabricator to document and implement the factory production control system. And when they have this in place, assuming it's certified and validated by the notified body, it gives this steel fabricator, it allows the steel fabricator to apply CE marking and issue declarations of performance. And it's important to note that the notified body does not have a role in setting up the factory production control system. That's purely the responsibility of the steel fabricator. The role of the notified body obviously is an initial audit, and also that's followed up by continuous surveillance at various intervals, you know, depending, you know, on the type of work that the fabricator does. So, as I mentioned there, the different fabricators have different sort of levels of capability from execution class 1 to execution class 4. It's not a case of once you have EN 1090 certification that you can fabricate for any type of steel building. Execution class 2 will apply for the majority of buildings constructed in Ireland. It must be specified by the structural engineer. It used to be at one point in time assumed as execution class 2 if it wasn't specified, but the latest revisions mean that it must be specified. And it's important to note that the main contractor should appoint a steel fabricator who has a certified execution class greater to or equal to that required for the project. So when EN 1090 Part 1 came out, there was some, I suppose, uncertainty as to the actual scope of the standard. And there was a consultation process with various national standard bodies, the NSAI, the BSI, etc. And it resulted in ultimately in the publication in 2017 of guidelines on implementing EN 1090. And this was published as a standard recommendation in 2017 by the NSAI. So Annex A includes 64 products that it states are covered by the scope of EN 1090 when the intended use comprises a structural function. Annex B then tries to then give an explicit list of products that are definitely not covered by EN 1090 CE marking and the requirement to provide DOPs. But the important point to note that it's not just the structural steel framing that requires CE marking. You know, it would also maybe include ancillary or miscellaneous steel work such as balconies, handrails, balustrades, canopies and shelters, walkways, stairs and ramps, and also, you know, special fabricated products like lintels that are not covered by the harmonized standard for lintels, masonry support systems such as those provided by Ancon, cold form purlins, cladding rails, and SFS type framing systems. So we know that in the last few years there have been 7 notified bodies who have been providing FBC certification to Irish steel fabricators. 3 of them based in the UK, 2 of them based in Ireland, and a couple based on the continent of Europe as well. The majority of the certification of steel fabricators in Ireland is done by the NSAI and Omni, and of those 2, Omni I think would have the lion's share of that. We're also aware of a further 8 UK-based notified bodies who have been active in recent years. We're not really sure of their level of involvement in terms of certifying Irish-based steel fabricators, but they were operating at a fairly low level in the UK. So I'd say they had a limited limited involvement in the market here. So I've noted there are some comments regarding the UK-based notified bodies. The SCCS, the Steel Construction Certification Scheme, is a well-known, should I say, notified body in the UK, but they're not migrating over to an EU27 affiliate. BM R and the Centre for Assessment, based out of Manchester in the UK, have belatedly sort of reached an agreement with some EU27 notified bodies who will be able to issue FBC certificates and welding certificates on their behalf. So kind of went down a rabbit hole around this time last year, if I'm being honest, maybe a little bit too much time in my hands, but we started looking initially maybe at a straw poll of maybe half or a dozen maybe steel fabricators just to get a sense of where the industry was, and the rabbit hole went quite deep and we ended up looking at over 230 steel fabricators. So we wanted to get a sense of where Irish steel fabricators were in terms of the notified bodies they were using, and we kind of come up with figures that suggested that there is a bit of a problem there in the market. Like, that figure of 17% of steel fabricators who we believe are possibly using a UK notified body, or we have no evidence of what their FBC certification status is, and also those who are popular in the case. So I think that's where the focus would need to be if we were actually kind of looking at projects and actually seeing where the problems may be and where the problematic, I suppose, from a CE marking point of view, where the problematic steel may be coming from. Now, it's important to point out that those figures are 17% and 11%, or that don't necessarily represent market shares of problematic steel work that may be coming to the market. The numbers here are just purely raw numbers of steel fabricators, but it's a good broad range, I suppose, across the industry. So it's an indication of a problem that we feel is still there with steel fabricators, and because it requires us project teams to be vigilant on this going forward. So what should we be checking as part of our projects? So, and typically on a project, you may have 3, perhaps more steel fabricators, supplying fabricated steel. You might have one fabricator supplying for the main framing. another fabricator supplying for balconies, and another supplying for hardings and handrails and guardings and things like that. So we need to review the factory production control certificate, and we need to review the welding certificate. And I'll move on to that shortly as to how we do that. We need to ensure that the FP certificate includes the appropriate execution class. We need to ensure that the FPC certificate also covers design. And it's important that this review happens at an early stage of the product, and we're not waiting for the DOP to be issued, because in accordance with the 1090 Part 1, the DOP is usually issued after the steel is fabricated. So obviously a review cannot wait until that point in time. So here are some factory production control and welding certificates. These are samples issued by a UK-based notified body, the Centre for Assessment. So there's 5 essential, I suppose, pieces of information that we want to be looking at. The first of these is the declared performance, and that would generally include the execution class for the fabricated steelwork. You can also generally garner from this information whether the fabricator is able to design or not. The base materials and welding is generally covered only on the welding certificate. And that's generally the welding process that they're permitted to use, and the strength of materials that they're permitted to weld. As you're probably aware, steel has varying strengths from grade S235 up to grade S700. And obviously there's different requirements depending what grade of steel that you're actually welding. What's also important are the expiry dates, and I'll get back to those shortly as to why I think they're very, very important, particularly. And 4 is the probably most important information, which is a notified body number. In this case, it's 2551, and that's a UK-based notified body. So if you start seeing factory production control certificates being offered up here for review by project teams, and it has this or other UK-based notified body numbers, you have to kind of seriously start asking questions. And the welding certificate would also usually have the name of the responsible welding coordinator. Now, it's important to note that the fabricator who this cert relates to, I've kind of done my best to blot out their name, but they're now actually certified by Omni. And I suppose it's probably a little bit reflective of maybe a bit of confusion that was about maybe in the early part of last year. I spoke with Centre for Assessment, kind of maybe around this time last year, to get a sense of where they stood in terms of the status of their factory production control certification, and how that would affect CE marking of Irish steel fabricators. And they didn't seem to have a definitive position on it. They felt they were in the middle of a transition period, but they were at that time negotiating with notified bodies in Europe who would be able to issue FPC certificates on their behalf. So that agreement is now in place, and what happens is that Centre for Assessment actually incorporate the procedures of these various notified bodies into what they do, and then the continental base notified bodies will issue the factory production control certificates and the welding certificates on behalf of Centre for Assessment. But it's important to note that Centre for Assessment, even though that arrangement is in place, they still not can issue the factory production control or welding certs themselves, because of the simple fact that the notified body number is a UK body, or UK notified body. So I'll just talk briefly about precast concrete as well. I don't believe the same, I suppose, level of uncertainty is here with precast products as it is with the steel products. Harmonized standards on precast products have been kind of coming out since 2004, and by 2013, the majority of the harmonized standards covering precast products that we would be concerned with, these were in place, and in July 2013, it became mandatory to apply CE marking to precast concrete products. So We know the following notified bodies are providing or have provided until recently FBC certification for Irish precast suppliers. The vast majority of that is done by the NSAI. There was, up until last year, perhaps half a dozen, maybe 8, maybe 10 prefabricated or precasters in Ireland who were certified via SGS in the UK, but all those certs have now been migrated over to their Portuguese affiliate. So the situation, the numbers look kind of similar there, you know, for precast suppliers when you compare it to the steel fabricators, you know, in terms of those who we would see we don't think are okay, or there is maybe some question mark. But to be honest with you, it's just confined to maybe a couple of precasters, maybe in a few areas of the country, in North Munster and across the Midlands. I don't to be a little bit more specific that in terms of locations. But to be honest with you, I wouldn't be as concerned about the CE marking starts on the precasters as I would be regarding the steel fabricators. So Archie has touched on it there, but I said, what are the implications of invalid CE marking? Obviously, products are deemed to have been placed on the market illegally, and there are fines of up to €500,000 or potential imprisonment that go along with that. Technically, it's a breach of a construction contract, because the majority of forms of construction contract, certainly the public works forms, require CE marking to be applied where it's required, and that's usually expressly stated in the contract. If it's not expressly stated in the contract, it's probably usually in the structural engineer's specification, and that would be deemed to form part of the contract. It would be a breach of contract, I suppose, if CE marking wasn't applied to the steelwork or precast products. As Archie has touched on, it presents a difficulty in justifying as proper materials under the Building Regulations Part D. And from an insurance perspective, like we've heard rumors that, you know, that people were denied settlements of insurance claims because, you know, the structure wasn't CE marked, but we haven't really come across any hard evidence of that being the case. You know, we don't see also that CE marking status is being asked of people when they are submitting proposal forms. But there is a possibility, I suppose, that insurance cover could be denied where a big insurance company is taking on the insurance of a very large development, and they perform their due diligence just to kind of get an understanding of the provenance of materials and products that have been incorporated into the building. And they may form a view, well, you know, CE marking hasn't been applied here, that's technically illegal, we're not going to cover you with insurance. So I think that's something that's important and to be aware of also. So I suppose, who is policing the construction product regulations in Ireland, you know, particularly in post-Brexit? Well, you know that the National Building Control Market Surveillance Unit is heavily involved here, but the local authorities also have a role. And I suppose the question is, we don't really know outside of Dublin what's happening there. Certainly, in my experience, you know, in the parts of the country I deal with down in Munster and the West, we don't know what's happening in terms of local authorities policing to CPR, but I'm sure things will change, like, you know, as we go forward.
Thanks, Stephen.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so Keith Elliott has a question. How is the CE mark not a quality mark, and what certification does qualify as a quality mark? And I suppose the answer of that is it was never intended as a quality mark. CE marking declares that the essential characteristics listed on the DOP meet the requirements in the standard for measuring those values. So within the standard in Annex ZA, it will say that you have to declare a particular characteristic. It'll say what the testing methodology is and what units are used. That's all that the standard implies.
Very good. Thanks, Archie. Yeah.
Stephen, could you go on mute there? Sorry. Thanks. So Michael has a question, and it's about, this comes up a lot, about specifying a scheme in Northern Ireland or the UK. And CE marking is recognised in the UK until the end of 2022, when they look for UK CA marking. I understand that's not going particularly well, that they might just extend that and recognise CE marking indefinitely. In Northern Ireland, I suppose because of the arrangement that Northern Ireland has, they can European regulatory processes are recognised. So UK CE marking, so CE marking is recognised in Northern Ireland indefinitely because of the protocol. And Busi, thanks. Yeah, so all products should really come with a certificate of compliance, but only where a harmonised standard applies does it need CE marking, and or where the manufacturer decides to go down the voluntary route and apply CE marking. So Keith, good question. Does a specifier have a liability in the event that its checks on a product fail to detect a compliance product? And if so, how can specifiers avoid this liability? Yeah, I suppose that's one that's I suppose that we've become familiar with block work in particular. But I think there are other products that will cause us difficulty in future. Particularly because construction has changed. You know, there's a lot of NZEB solutions, very low energy solutions, which is the right thing to do, but we're seeing new materials, new assemblies, you know, rain screens done a different way, very wide cavities with rock wool. We're seeing very different assemblies than we would traditionally have been used to over the last 30 years. So if a product is high consequence and or has a high likelihood of failure, then you have to delve deeper. And we've seen a lot of products, you know, things like calcium silicate and magnesium oxide boards, being asked to undertake additional pull tests on those, and a lot of systems like brick slip retaining systems undergoing further testing. So if there's any risk that's implied, or you don't feel that the information you have covers the specific risks of that product, then you have to go deeper, and you really have to, you know, we spend a fortune on standards because you really have to look into the industry standard for particular products and just see what testing, and there's a lot of testing that needs to be undertaken on products. So is the notified body's address always on the DOP, or is it required to be on the DOP? It's a 4-letter number that's generally put on the DOP, and you have to look up the NANDO database. So the resources that we'll share will have those links. So it's a 4-digit number. So Stephen has shown you how, you know, he's looked up the notified bodies for, say, precast, and from that you get the address. But those numbers, if they're UK addressed, you should get a new cert which has the Dutch affiliate or the French or Irish affiliate in lieu of that number, in lieu of the Irish number. How are plants audited? And it's NSAI will produce a technical specification, and you know, for steelwork, that'll be that the steelwork has to be numbered. If the steelwork is cut, it has to be recorded in a certain way. They have to have drawings. So there is a procedure. They have to follow the EN 1090 procedure, and NSAI will check against that through technical specification and through audits, and then through continuous surveillance. Okay, and that kind of was a process that takes about at least a year, and they're quite busy with that. Manufacturer should be held responsibility for low quality. No, it's everyone's duty, and it's ultimately the client's responsibility. So specifiers do have quite an onerous duty to you know, to make sure that the products they're specifying, whether they're nominating products or whether they're doing a performance specification, they need to make sure that they know the appropriate controls that are needed, both on the manufacturer side And we've seen a lot of, like we undertake a lot of factory inspections or walk downs, particularly when it gets to modular and offsite. So, you know, there's novel products, there's risky products where you need to do that. So, good question, Abusi. QA and QC is key to how you ensure manufacturer adhere to standards. Yeah, and look, we think technical submittals are critical, and factory visits are key. And to the point that, you know, if we're looking at an offsite manufacturing company, which we're seeing a huge change from wet trades traditional to SFS and offsite, you know, 3D, 2D volumetric, you really need to see their quality plan, because some of these they're just startups in a shed, and look at their ITP and build from there. So yeah, look, there's some products we've been using for years, very shallow level of scrutiny, but there's others you need to dig deep, you need to go deep, and we've seen additional testing. That's a good idea, Kieran. I'll put together an extra slide just with the definitions and the interpretations. It's a bit of an alphabet soup, which you engineers seem to love in terms of acronyms. And yeah, I can do that. I might give these ones to you, Stephen, the further questions. Oh, you've answered. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, Archie, which ones? Sorry, we're looking at. Sorry, just make sure.
Oh, sorry, did I have it on screen? I'll ask the question. Are the FPC and welder certificates always two separate documents, or can they be combined?
They're always two separate documents. You know, in some situations you could have an FPC certificate, but you wouldn't need as part of your process to actually do any welding, so you wouldn't have a welding cert. So they're always two separate documents, but they should cross-reference and tie in with each other. Okay,
yeah. When should the DOP be issued to the client's representative, design engineer? Is this before delivery to site, during erection, or afterwards? I suppose we get DOPs at different stages, but technical submittal stage is becoming more important for this. But you know, yeah, if designers are specifying a specific supplier, they should, even at design stage, you should look at that. Another question for you, Stephen.
Just regarding the issuing of the DOP, Archie, you know, I think it's a requirement via 1090, I think, Annex ZA, that it's issued after the steel is fabricated. So it's obviously too late then to look at the DOP and kind of find out if you have a problem. So it needs to be looking at the factory production control certs and the welding certs kind of at an early stage. And like you could make the argument that if you did that at an early enough stage, it could influence the procurement process.
Okay, I'm just conscious it's just hit 9 o'clock now, and I'll just get back to the